Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. In this video we'll be covering round 1 of the Daily Chess Championship by chess.com, and in this video I'll be looking at some of my favorite games I played, analyzing some of my moves, and I'll be talking you through some of my thinking throughout. So yeah, I hope you enjoy. Alright guys, so let's look at how the whole thing ended. So as you can see, I finished with a perfect score of 22 out of 22. I won all of my games and will be advancing to the next round. And as usual, there were quite a few timeouts, so I really only had to play half the field, but still it was fairly entertaining, and some good fights were put up by these guys despite the rating disparity here. So yeah, let's look at the games. Alright guys, so this first game that I'm showing you is a fairly quick one. It ended fairly quickly because of an opening mistake my opponent made, and I was able to capitalize on it quite well. So as you can see here, I started off the game with b3, bishop b2, and here already my opponent goes wrong by playing bishop e7. I found that developing the bishop to the long diagonals can often surprise the lower rated opponents and make things like this happen. So now my opponent's blundered his rook. Here he plays bishop f6, but instead of taking his bishop, I just take his rook. And when he takes back, I'm just up the exchange. And now we keep playing. I stop him from taking my rook back, and now I'm just happy to simplify the game, exchange some pieces, and slowly win out. So now he offers an exchange of the bishops, which I accept, and I just castle and play it very safe here. So I kick back his knight and just expand on the queen side here. Given the fact that we've castled opposite sides, I want to push my pawns here very quickly, and now he plays knight g4. I just kick the knight back and just keep expanding. And now I play b5 and just play a4, really just steamroll him here, really put on the pressure. And now he makes another mistake, which is knight c3, which attacks my queen and possibly allows a fork on e2, but the problem is, if I simply play queen c2 or even queen d3, then his knight is trapped, because I'm holding this e4 escape square. And so he sacks his knight. I take back with the pawn, opening up my rook, and now I think my opponent's already lost, and here he tries to create some space for his king, but the problem is I can play b6, and now this is really a suffocating position, and in this position my opponent tries to go for my king, go for my rook with his king, but I simply double up, and no matter what he plays now, I'm just planning on going rook a8 and mating him. And now he sacrifices his queen, but I simply ignore that and play checkmate, which is the end of the first game already. Alright, so in this next game that I'm going to show you, it's actually a very, very embarrassing one, because I made a pretty bad blunder and should have lost this game, but I ended up winning, and I'm just going to show you how it worked. So my opponent starts off with e4, and I play a Caro-Kann. We get an advanced variation, and this is all fairly standard stuff. And after a while here, I try and maneuver my knights in a way to be able to pressure this d-pawn, because he's got his queen on this square where his pawn should really be, and I'm trying to use that fact against him. So I go knight f5, which pressures the pawn, and hopefully I can go for a c5 and maybe rook c8 along the line as well. And after we keep playing, I go bishop f8, which is a bit of a cheeky trap, hoping for an unattentive move so that I can play bishop b4, skewering his queen and king with my bishop. Unfortunately, he sees this, but now I go for a4, a5, a4, intending to kick away this knight which is protecting the d-pawn. And so he castles, and I am able to kick the knight away, and now I will win this d-pawn, and I'm in a very, very good position. So now he contests my a-pawn, and I simply move my bishop back to g7, adding a second attacker to this e-pawn now. And he defends it, but I still have two attackers, so I just take with the knight. And after the move rook b1, sorry, I realize that my bishop and his queen are lined up. And I thought, right, well, both of my knights can check on this f3 square, which means that possibly I could go for a double revealed attack in a way and win his queen. Unfortunately, I make a very, very bad miscalculation here after playing the move knight e2. And the problem is, I figured that if I had checked with knight e3, then he could have moved to the side with his king, and I wouldn't get another check with my other knight, which meant that in order to ensure that the king would stay where he is for the second knight to check, I played knight e2 in hopes that bishop takes, knight f3 check, bishop takes, and then bishop takes queen. The problem is that I missed the fact that after I play knight e2 and the bishop takes, when I play knight f3, the queen can actually capture the knight and is no longer hanging. So in this position, I should be completely lost. The problem is that my opponent unfortunately missed this just like I did, and actually took with the with the g-pawn, and allowed me to take his queen. So now I'm completely winning, even though I should be completely losing, as you can see, just one move before. It went from +4 to -4 essentially, and I should have really lost this game, but I ended up winning it. And now the game is more or less done. I just need to make sure not to blunder anything major. I just trade down pieces and advance my pawns on the queen side. And here I attack his bishop, forcing it to move away. And instead of retreating his bishop, he attacks my queen, which is another mistake because now I can check and take. And now I'm attacking two of his bishops, and he will lose one of them. And this just makes his material disadvantage even worse. And here he goes for my c-pawn, but instead of defending it, I just go for a very, very cheeky checkmate threat, which unfortunately he sees, and now I defend my pawn. The problem is this is all really just irrelevant at this point because I just need to advance my pawns and will win this game. And in this position, my opponent resigns in view of the fact that I have an overwhelming material advantage. I have very, very easy play on both sides of the board. I can just advance my pawns and I will win this game fairly simply. Okay, so this final game is actually against the guy who ended up being in second place, and he was actually a very tough nut to crack, and we ended up in a really nice rook end game, which I managed to convert, so let's see how that went. So he started with d4, d5, and we get a London, and I play the most critical variation with c5 in return. And he trades off his light square bishop very early, which I'm under the impression that that's not so accurate, and I think we already left the opening database theory at this point. So I don't think any of these games have been played before, and yeah, so I was on my own at this point in the game. And so I play queen a5, and I take back the pawn, and here he plays knight f3, and I believe the engine says that in this position I should go f6 and e5, but playing very principled chess, I didn't like the idea of f6, and so I played something else, and I played knight g4, bishop g4, pinning the knight to the queen. The problem is that this is not really the most accurate, and as you'll see in a second, it did come back to haunt me a little bit here. I should have just taken the knight. For some reason I decided to retreat to maintain the pin, but I did correct that mistake just a move later here. I decided to take. And in this position I think I'm quite a bit worse. I think if my opponent had simply infiltrated with his queen, I would have had to react, and he could have taken back the bishop a move later. He did take back with the pawn though, and now I'm able to block this infiltration and offer a trade of queens. And while this would be an even end game, I was fairly happy to just draw one of these games as well. And so we trade queens, and I play e6 defending my d-pawn, and my opponent castles, and now I attack his knight. And in this position, this is a very critical position because my opponent decides to defend his knight with his bishop. And I'm going to give you a second to figure out how you can win a piece in this position, because there is a way to force the bishop away from the defense. And the move is actually knight h5. The move knight h5 works because after knight h5, if your bishop goes here, you can simply keep harassing this bishop until it steps away from this diagonal where it protects the knight. And now you force it to take something else, and you'll be able to capture the knight for free. The problem is, I only calculated the move e5 and I thought after e5 and bishop here, even if I kicked the bishop again, he could take, and now I'm only really trading pieces because now he gets a chance to move the knight away or protect it again. And so in this position, I don't win a piece. Instead, what I do is I take the knight, and when he takes back, I win a pawn on e4, and I enter this endgame up a pawn. And so he puts his bishop on the long diagonal, and I go king e7. Idea is to support the rooks on this possibly open d file. And side note here, if you capture on g7, rook g8 would win your bishop. So that was just a little trap I set for him as well. And so he goes b4, and I aim for the c4 weakness that he just created, and he fixes the structure with c5, which I was fairly happy with, because I was worried before about the move b5, but now b5 would just be met with c takes b5. And in this position he goes for the open file, and I decide to go for the rook endgame. So now rook endgames up a pawn usually are still fairly even, so I was guessing this is probably objectively a draw, but I thought that I had some reasonable chance to convert this. So I go for the open file as well, and now he goes rook d4, threatening to, or I guess offering to trade the rooks, but on his terms, which would undouble his pawns, which I was not happy to do. So I just go rook d5, and now I just expand with my pawns on the king side. I'm hoping to create a majority here and maybe create a passed pawn, which would give me the chance perhaps to move my king up and take these pawns while he's focused over here. And so I move up my king, and now he decides to trade the rooks and relieve the tension, which I was very, very happy to see, because now I think I'm completely out of danger of ever losing this game, of ever being worse. And of course I take with the e-pawn. Had I taken with the c-pawn, then he could have played the move b5, and he would actually get two connected passed pawns here, because I can't take this pawn because my rook would be hanging. So instead I take with the e-pawn, which prevents all of his pawn breaks here and just holds down this queenside really nicely and allows me to focus on this kingside majority that I have. And so he plays f4, and I just protect the pawn. And now he goes b5, which I think is a big mistake because it allows me to take with the c-pawn. And even though he gets a passed pawn here, my king is very much fast enough to get here. So we trade one set of g-pawns, and now when he goes c7, I just scoot my king here to d7, and whatever happens with this pawn, my king will have it under control. And now my opponent realizes that he has to do something fast because he's now down 2 pawns. And he goes for my f-pawn, but I just protect it with my rook. My king has this pawn under control, as I've said, and now he decides to go back. And I think in this position my opponent's already lost, because I can enter a winning rook endgame in this position. So after f4 and king f3, I decide to go rook e8, idea being that I can go rook e3 and capture these hanging pawns on the third rank and just enter a winning rook endgame where I have extra pawns on the board. And so he goes king g4, and I go rook e3 anyway, and now when he takes, it's important that I take this h-pawn because this is the much more dangerous one. It's the passed pawn, and it's on the edge where his king is, so I would have to be very, very careful if I didn't take this pawn. And now he takes my f-pawn, and I take his c-pawn, and you can see we're entering simplification here, but the problem is the simplification is simply not good enough for him because I'm up 2 pawns, and while they're still separate, my king and rook are in positions where I can very quickly push them up and make them become queens. And now he makes his final mistake actually with the move rook d6, and while this rook is protected, I can actually deliver a check, and now you're forced to move your king to a square where you protect your rook at the same time, which is the d5 square. Because if you went to d4 or f4 and you captured my rook, a king and pawn endgame with 2 extra pawns is always going to be winning. And so he goes king takes d5, but the problem is now I can skewer the king and queen, and I will win his rook. And Now we're in a king and rook endgame, and I have to demonstrate good technique, but the problem is I've been here often enough, and I've played this often enough to know how to checkmate with a king and rook, and we get a checkmate fairly quickly. Alright, so that was a quick recap of some of my most interesting games of the first round of the 2024 Chess.com Daily Chess Championship. I really hope you enjoyed, and yeah, hopefully see you again in my second round recap.